At my sister's birthday, I walked in with gifts. She looked me up and down and said, "You weren't invited." I didn't argue. I handed the gifts to her kids and walked out. By the end of the night, she wished I had stayed. I left her house without raising my voice or defending myself. The gifts weren't for her anyway. They were for the children, who were too young to be involved in whatever grudge she held. As I walked to my car, I felt the familiar mix of humiliation and resignation, like I had been set up to fail no matter how I approached the situation. I didn't plan revenge. I just removed myself, hoping the night would continue peacefully. But the bitterness she carried had a way of poisoning everything, even when I wasn't physically present. The air outside felt warmer than it had inside the house, even though the weather was cooling down with the evening. The neighborhood was lit by strings of cheap lights that people put up for gatherings, and I could still hear faint noise from the backyard, a blend of laughter, clattering plates, and the agitated tone she always had when she performed irritation for attention. It didn't surprise me that she would use her own birthday as a stage. It had always been like that, every family event turning into a chance for someone to be compared to someone else, usually in ways that were meant to embarrass me. I grew up adjusting my posture and tone depending on how tense she was, like I had to protect everyone from her moods before they burst open and splashed onto the room. I sat in my car for a moment before turning the engine. I expected tears, a shaking chest, something dramatic, but it just wasn't there. I felt drained more than wounded. Disappointment felt too familiar to hurt anymore. I watched the house from the windshield, seeing silhouettes move back and forth, and I reminded myself that I didn't want to be in that space, even if she had greeted me politely. I still would have been uncomfortable, still would have played the role of being quiet enough not to offend her, but generous enough to not appear resentful. It was a position I learned young, being the sibling who didn't stir tragedy. The drive home was slow, and the roads were mostly empty. The streetlights gave everything a dull orange color, and the houses I passed looked peaceful in a way that didn't belong to me. I thought about the kids holding the gifts I left behind, how excited they probably were to open them, because I always tried to get something thoughtful rather than flashy. Not because I wanted credit, but because I wanted them to have things they could use or enjoy for more than a few hours. It felt pathetic to care this much when my sister seemed determined to twist it all into a personal insult. She had mastered the art of painting generosity as manipulation, until anyone kind looked guilty and anyone cruel looked justified. When I reached my apartment, the building was quiet except for a television humming behind someone's door. I unlocked my place and set my phone on the table, relieved to be somewhere neutral. I didn't bother turning on the main light, letting the dim hallway lamps spill just enough illumination into the room. I sat on the couch without taking off my shoes, staring into the blank space where I usually put work projects or groceries I forgot to unload. There was no anger in me, just a slow, heavy ache that made my muscles feel tired even though the day hadn't been physically demanding. I sometimes wondered if years of small humiliations added weight to the body, the same way dust accumulated in places you never remembered seeing dirty. I tried to distract myself, scrolling through unread emails, adjusting the thermostat, picking up a jacket and folding it neatly on the coffee table, just to feel like I had control over something. But my mind kept looping back to the moment she looked at me, the silent judgment stretched across her face, like she believed I had shown up only to ruin something she believed she deserved. I couldn't figure out the origin of her grudge anymore. Maybe it wasn't one moment. Maybe it was a long accumulation of things she thought she should have had, and I represented the version of life that slipped through her fingers. I lived simply, but on my own terms, and that seemed to be enough to irritate her. I poured myself a glass of water because I hadn't eaten anything at the party, and the emptiness in my stomach felt too raw. I thought about heating something up, but the idea of food made me nauseous in the same quiet way stress usually did. There was a part of me that wished I could erase the urge to show up for family occasions altogether, because it always ended the same. Me standing in the doorway, unsure if I was allowed to exist in the space, and her setting new rules for what respect looked like depending on her mood. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling, watching the shadows shift from passing cars. There was a small comfort in silence, but also a loneliness that wasn't dramatic, just steady. I didn't want isolation, but I didn't want chaos either, and there never seemed to be a comfortable middle ground with family. People always talked about closeness like it was an automatic blessing, never acknowledging how much harm could hide in familiarity. I had experienced more cruelty from relatives than strangers, more casual cruelty disguised as jokes than outright violence. It was always small but sharp. As the night pushed deeper, I tried to let the tension fade. I had done what I thought was right, showed up, stayed calm, refused to give her more reasons to resent me. Leaving felt weak in the moment, but sitting on the couch hours later, it felt necessary. I didn't want to be a character in her performance anymore, not the villain she loved inventing. The world inside my apartment was quiet, ordinary, dull even, but it belonged to me, and nobody inside it treated me like an inconvenience. I didn't know then that removing myself didn't stop anything. I didn't realize that silence would be the very thing that ignited everything else that followed, the moment when absence became louder than presence, when the version of the story she told others had to be dramatic enough to fill the empty space I left behind. I didn't know there would be messages waiting for me, stacked on my phone before I even took off my shoes, or that everyone who heard her version would start demanding mine. I didn't know the night would unravel without me saying a word, that walking away wouldn't end anything, but trigger something worse, something messy, something she couldn't control because the audience she depended on stopped clapping long before I reached my car. I arrived home to dozens of missed notifications. My sister didn't wait long before twisting the story, telling everyone I stormed out dramatically and ruined her night. She sent long messages framing herself as a victim, conveniently leaving out the part where she had dismissed me in front of guests. I said nothing. Other relatives asked what really happened, but I didn't respond. Silence made her frantic. She wasn't satisfied with excluding me. She needed validation. When I refused to give her that, she escalated. The notifications kept coming in waves, buzzing on the table where I had left my phone. Every time I walked past it, the screen lit up with another alert, another comment, another attempt at turning the situation into something that made her look sympathetic. I kept ignoring them because I didn't know how to answer without turning the entire night into a public autopsy of what had been building for years. I didn't want to defend myself or craft explanations that would only open more arguments. I didn't trust anyone in that group chat to read my words without twisting them the same way she did. I had seen it happen before, moments where I tried to explain calmly and ended up being accused of overthinking, overreacting, or playing the victim. It was easier to say nothing, to let the noise wash over the walls instead of trying to scrub every message clean. The room around me felt heavy, not because it was dark, but because it held the kind of quiet that followed emotional battles. I hadn't fought anyone, but it still felt like I had been somewhere loud. I walked from one end of the room to the other, trying to shake off the tension settling in my shoulders. I opened the window slightly to let in cool air, hoping it would bring a sense of balance. Outside, a neighbor was smoking on the staircase, the flick of their lighter brief and sharp. The night smelled like cigarette smoke and dew, something familiar and grounding. It was a reminder that there were lives around me that weren't wrapped up in my family's drama, people who didn't know or care about the fights that had weighed in my mind. At some point I muted the group chat, not because I wanted to escape entirely, but because the notifications made the apartment feel invaded. Even with the phone upside down, I knew the messages kept coming. It wasn't hard to imagine the tone of them. People asking for the full story, relatives offering half-hearted advice, cousins dropping vague judgments, all of it based on what she wrote. She was probably writing paragraphs, describing herself as blindsided, overwhelmed, gracious but misunderstood. I had seen her do this before, build a narrative that erased her part in the situation and painted everyone else as unpredictable. She needed sympathy like oxygen. Without it, she suffocated. Eventually I sat down on the floor, leaning against the couch, trying not to think about how predictable this was. It didn't matter how calm I was, or how gently I walked into that house. She would still find a way to weaponize the moment, because the real conflict had never been about what I did, but about what I represented. My presence alone was enough to disrupt the image she wanted for herself. Even the gifts I brought, intended for the children, would be turned into evidence of some hidden agenda. She would say I was trying to show her up, or that I brought presents to make her look unprepared. I could imagine her shaping those claims now, typing them quickly, sending them into the group chat with the confidence of someone who believed her story should be accepted. The most exhausting part was knowing I couldn't stop her from doing it. Confrontation wouldn't fix anything. Correcting the story wouldn't shut it down. It would just feed it more pieces to twist. So the silence wasn't passive or weak. It was self-protection. It was choosing not to step back into a playing field where the rules always changed depending on who felt threatened. I let her words move through the digital world without resistance, even though I knew each message would carve out a position for me I hadn't chosen. What bothered me wasn't that she lied, but how easily people absorbed her version of events. It took almost nothing for her to make others believe that I was dramatic, over-emotional, unstable. She didn't even need to explicitly say it. She could imply it with phrasing, with exaggerated details, with selective omissions. She had been doing this most of her life, rewriting memories until reality bent to her advantage. I had learned slowly, painfully, that arguing with someone like that didn't change them. It just dragged you into the mess. I got up again and walked to the kitchen, not to eat, but just to move. I filled a glass with water and stood over the sink. The phone buzzed again from the other room, and even though I couldn't see the screen, the sound carried a sense of urgency. I didn't feel guilty for leaving, but I did feel tired of being the character she created. It felt unfair that she could stay at the center of everyone's attention, while I was expected to explain myself, justify every decision, provide context for simple actions like walking away. I thought about messaging her directly, not to fight, but to ask why she couldn't just let things be. But I already knew the answer. If I didn't feed the drama, she would create more of it. She didn't know how to be satisfied with a moment unless it validated her superiority. I had stepped away from her spotlight, and that alone was enough to send her into a spiral. The longer I sat in the kitchen, the more I realized that the conflict wasn't happening in the house anymore. It had moved into everyone's palms, into the little screens lighting up rooms all over the family. It wasn't a fight between siblings now, but a story being passed around, reshaped by people who wanted to believe whatever version made them feel better about their own choices. They weren't really listening for truth. They were waiting for confirmation of what they already assumed. Beneath all of that noise, I felt strangely calm. Not happy, not triumphant, just steady. I didn't have to perform. I didn't have to rush to clean up a mess I didn't make. I didn't have to be responsible for keeping the family's mood stable. I could sit in my quiet apartment while the storm raged somewhere else, and let it burn itself out without me. Eventually I went back to the couch, picked up the phone, and looked at the screen. There were messages stacked one after another, long threads filled with sharp fragments, worried comments, passive-aggressive remarks. I didn't open them. I didn't respond. I set the phone down again, screen facing the table, and leaned back, letting the silence take over. I had no idea what she was saying about me by that point, or how many people were debating it. All I knew was that I wasn't there, and that alone made her unravel faster than anything I could have said. She wanted a scene, and when I didn't give it to her, she built one anyway, desperate to fill the absence I left behind. By late evening, one of her neighbors messaged me privately. The kids had been upset when I left. They kept asking where I went and why. My sister tried to distract them with games and food, but they carried the gifts around the house, calling my name. That attention irritated her more than anything. She had wanted a night focused on herself, her decorations, her curated attention. Having the children proudly show off what I brought highlighted the absence she tried to force. Her resentment spread to everyone around her. I sat on my couch reading that message over and over, thinking about how innocent children have a way of peeling the mask off situations without even trying. They didn't care about adult politics, invitations, grudges that stretched back years. They cared that I came, and then I was gone. They cared that I remembered them enough to bring things they liked. They didn't understand that my departure was a relief to adults, not to them. That simple confusion became another crack in the performance my sister had been building all evening. The neighbor described the kids dragging the bags around like small suitcases, showing people items as if they were proof of something good, something worth attention. I pictured their hands gripping the handles, their little bodies weaving between clusters of adults, unaware of the tension thickening the air. I imagined how my sister's smile must have tightened, how her voice must have risen slightly higher as she tried to maintain control. She was always most fragile when she thought someone else was getting credit she believed belonged to her. I set the phone down and leaned my head back, letting the silence of my apartment swallow the scene being described to me. It was strange to witness the collapse from a distance. I wasn't physically present, but somehow my absence had become the center of the night. I didn't feel satisfaction from it. There was no pride in imagining the party dissolving into discomfort. There was only an odd heaviness, the sense that I had unintentionally triggered something I had tried to avoid. I wasn't looking for validation from anyone there. I had walked away specifically to prevent this kind of unraveling. But children didn't know how to pretend things were fine. They didn't know how to swallow disappointment or rewrite events to make adults feel better. They carried truth around in their arms, loudly, without apology. Every person they approached with my gifts became another reminder that someone important had walked out the door, not because they wanted to, but because they were told they didn't belong. That truth didn't fit the version my sister had just blasted through the family chat. It didn't match her story of me storming out to cause a scene. And when truth doesn't match performance, something ugly always follows. I sat there imagining how quickly her mood must have shifted once she realized she couldn't hide behind easy explanations. She wasn't just annoyed that I had shown up. She was annoyed that I left without reacting. She needed a public moment to assert control, to prove something. And when she didn't get it, she replaced it with a narrative that painted me as unstable, petty, dramatic. But children didn't care about narratives. They just wanted to know where I went. The neighbor told me the kids sat together with the gifts afterward, not playing, just waiting. They thought I might come back. That image hurt in a way I wasn't prepared for, not because I believed they needed me, but because I realized how little space existed for innocence in my family. Everything good was swallowed by competition, resentment, insecurity. Even a child's happiness was treated as a threat if it didn't center the right adult. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself something to drink, not because I wanted it, but because sitting still made my thoughts too loud. The cup felt cold in my hand, grounding. I stared at the dark window, seeing my reflection faintly, blurred by the low light. I didn't look angry or sad. I just looked tired, as if the situation had scraped away whatever energy I had left. I wondered if this was adulthood, learning to walk away from situations that didn't deserve you, even if walking away hurt people you didn't intend to leave behind. I thought about the last expression I saw on my sister's face before I left. It wasn't triumph, even though she probably thought she had succeeded in pushing me out. It was something more unsettled, like she hadn't expected me to comply so easily. She wanted confrontation. She wanted something dramatic she could point to later. Instead, she got quiet surrender, and quiet surrender left her with nothing to perform in front of her audience. That nothing was unbearable to her. I stood there in the kitchen, sipping mechanically, wondering how long it would take before she destroyed what was left of the evening. I knew her patterns. She could hold things together for a while if she believed she was winning. But once the attention shifted, once she felt unseen, she unraveled faster than anyone I knew. The children asking where I went, the gifts being carried around like trophies, the absence of drama she could manipulate into a heroic story, all of it would erode her self-control. It struck me that there was a deep loneliness inside her that no amount of attention would soothe. She was hungry for admiration but terrified of exposure. People like that burned everything around them just to avoid being the only one in ashes. And I had spent years trying to shield others from that fire, stepping in quietly, smoothing over conflicts, absorbing impact. Tonight, I chose not to play that role. I didn't put myself between her and the burn. I let the flames find their way without me. I walked back into the living room and sat on the floor again, leaning against the couch. The apartment felt still, safe, neutral. I imagined the opposite atmosphere at her house, the noise, the forced cheer, the scattered tension. I imagined adults exchanging glances while pretending to focus on food, decorations, music. I imagined the children still waiting, still hopeful, unaware that adults often choose pride over peace. The neighbor ended their message by saying they wished I hadn't left, not because the night was ruined, but because the children loved me. That sentence sat heavy in my chest. Not loved, past tense. Loved. Present. Ongoing. Consistent. I didn't want to be the reason someone's birthday fell apart, even indirectly. I didn't want to be the person adults used as a scapegoat for their own insecurities. But I also didn't want to stay where I wasn't welcome. Those two truths didn't cancel each other out. They just sat next to each other, uncomfortable and unresolved. I put my phone aside and wrapped my arms loosely around my knees, letting the quiet settle again. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know how she would react when the attention finally slipped away from her, or how far she would go to reclaim control of the room. I didn't know if the night would end with everyone calmly leaving, or with something fractured beyond repair. I only knew one thing. The party I walked away from would not be the same party that continued without me. And somewhere in that house, surrounded by decorations and noise and expectations, my sister would feel that absence more intensely than anyone else, because the emptiness wasn't mine anymore. It was hers. Around dinner time, tensions reached a boiling point. My sister had been drinking and complaining loudly about me to anyone who would listen. When one relative commented that I didn't make a scene, she snapped and started yelling in front of guests. Her kids sat at the table clutching the gifts, confused and frightened. One of them cried. Someone tried to calm her down, but she kicked a chair and stormed off. The party atmosphere collapsed instantly. No one was laughing anymore. People whispered about leaving early. The neighbors' messages didn't describe every detail, but there was enough to paint the picture clearly. What had started as a birthday celebration had shifted into a tense, heavy gathering where everyone moved carefully, afraid to set her off again. People lowered their voices, kept their eyes down, avoided lingering too long near her. The decorations that had looked cheerful earlier now felt theatrical, as if they were props in a performance that had lost its script. The house smelled like food no one really wanted to eat anymore. The music, once loud enough to drown out awkward silence, now sat low and uncertain, like background noise in a waiting room. She had always been unpredictable when she drank. The alcohol didn't create the anger, it just stripped away the filter she used to disguise it. When she felt exposed, she lashed out, not in explosive bursts but in erratic waves that left people unsure whether to comfort her or shrink back. She didn't crumble gracefully. She crumbled violently, demanding someone else hold the pieces even as she slapped their hands away. Tonight was no different, except she didn't have me there to balance her out, to absorb impact or redirect her attention. Without that buffer, she turned her frustration on whoever happened to be closest. I imagined relatives exchanging stiff glances, silently debating whether to intervene or pretend nothing was happening. Adults are skilled at denial when it comes to family dysfunction. They will sit through emotional chaos rather than acknowledge it. They will call someone tired or stressed instead of saying they are unstable. Denial turns messy situations into something vague enough to tolerate. But even denial has limits. When a chair is kicked, when a child cries, when voices echo in a room full of decorations meant for celebration, people stop pretending everything is fine. One of the kids reportedly sat on the floor clutching the bag of toys, as though holding onto something stable. Children don't know how to process erratic behavior. They only know when someone they love becomes unpredictable. They don't analyze motives or history. They only feel fear. The neighbor said the crying didn't stop quickly. It echoed through the room, cutting through whatever thin layer of calm people tried to rebuild. Someone picked the child up, carried them away, speaking gently, but children aren't fooled by soothing tones when the environment is still tense. They feel the atmosphere in their bodies long before they understand it in their minds. My sister disappeared into the hallway, vanishing behind a closed door, leaving a silence that was somehow louder than her yelling. People didn't rush after her at first, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't want to walk directly into the storm. There is a kind of exhaustion that comes from watching someone self-destruct and knowing you can't stop it. Anyone who had known her long enough had already learned that comfort was temporary and confrontation was disastrous. So they waited, unsure whether she would come back crying or come back swinging. Food sat cooling on the table, untouched. Drinks remained half-finished. The cake, which she had posted about for weeks, waited untouched in the kitchen, becoming a symbol of a celebration that never settled into joy. People checked their phones, pretending to read messages, looking for excuses to leave without seeming insensitive. They weren't leaving because of me. They were leaving because she had turned the night into a battlefield, and no one wanted to become collateral damage. The neighbor said one of the relatives whispered something about how I never caused drama, and that comment triggered the outburst. I could almost hear it. Just the mention of my absence, not in a critical way, but in a neutral, observational way, set her off. It wasn't even praise. It was just an acknowledgement of a fact, and that was enough to detonate her insecurity. She needed me to be the problem, even when I wasn't there. She needed someone to carry the role she wrote for them. When people refused to accept that narrative, she lost the fragile sense of control she had been clinging to. I pictured her pacing in the hallway, chest tight, mind racing, replaying moments from earlier, rewriting them into something that protected her from the realization that she had created the scene she feared. She would convince herself it wasn't her fault. She was pushed. She was provoked. She was misunderstood. People like her don't break quietly in the dark. They break loudly, demanding witnesses. The neighbor said a group of women eventually followed her into the hallway, trying to coax her back, speaking softly, telling her to take a breath, to sit down, to eat something. I had seen that routine too many times. The forced gentleness, the soothing tone, the practiced patience. The way everyone gathered around her pain, while silently ignoring the damage she caused. It was always a loop, disruption, collapse, coddling, temporary calm, repeated again later. And people kept participating in it, because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't. Meanwhile, her kids were shuffled to another room, away from the noise, away from the tension. They weren't old enough to articulate their feelings, but they understood abandonment instinctively. They understood when attention shifted, when warmth disappeared, when joy evaporated. Children don't forget those moments. They store them deep inside, in places adults later call insecurity, anxiety, or distrust. They don't remember the details. They remember the feeling. By the time she emerged from the hallway, the energy of the party had drained. People had stopped trying to salvage the evening. They were waiting for it to end. She tried to re-enter the room with a forced smile, but her face betrayed her, tight around the eyes, stiff in the jaw. Alcohol made her expression uneven, too loose and too rigid at the same time. She sat at the table and stared at her plate without eating. Someone put food in front of her, but she didn't touch it. The neighbor said the room went so quiet that the only sound was the clink of utensils and the occasional murmur from a child. Nobody spoke my name, but my absence was like a shadow walking through the house, brushing past shoulders, lingering near corners. People didn't know how to talk about it, because admitting it mattered meant acknowledging what caused it. I spent the night alone on my couch, unaware of every detail as it unfolded, but aware in a deeper way that something inevitable had happened. I had stepped out of a role I had played for years, and my sister was experiencing what life looked like without that buffer. She could blame me all she wanted, but the truth was simple. The moment I left, she had to face herself without a mirror to direct her anger toward. And she didn't know how to do that without making everyone else pay for it. I went back to the house that night, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to see it with my own eyes. I wanted proof that I wasn't crazy, that I hadn't overreacted, that the place I once called home was now just a shell built around lies. The driveway looked the same, but the lights were on, and through the window I could see boxes stacked along the wall. Not my boxes. Not my life. Everything that belonged to me was already gone, stripped clean, like someone had erased me without hesitation. I stood outside for a long time, grounding myself in the quiet. I didn't knock. I didn't want them to open the door and look at me like I was a stranger trespassing on their property. I just stared at the bricks, the windows, the porch, the pieces of life I used to believe would hold me forever. It was strange how quickly a place could stop being home, how fast 4 walls could become just walls. I didn't think about revenge or justice that night. I thought about the hours I spent scrubbing floors on my days off, the meals I cooked because I thought it mattered, the small gestures of care that were never enough to buy me space or respect. I thought about the moment they decided my life was disposable, and how easily they justified it as practical, necessary, inevitable. The road back to my aunt's house felt longer than it should. The air smelled like rain, and for a moment I hoped it would storm hard enough to wash everything clean. By the time I stepped inside, everyone else was asleep. The house was dark and quiet, and I stood in that silence with a bag of clothes and the leftovers of the life I had been handed instead of the one I built. I went to the room they gave me, a small guest room with mismatched furniture and blankets that smelled like laundry detergent. It wasn't much. It wasn't home. But it was mine for now, and it was more than what I'd had 12 hours earlier. I sat on the edge of the bed and realized that what hurt wasn't losing the house. It was losing the illusion that I belonged anywhere at all. Morning came slow, heavy, and unfamiliar. My aunt didn't ask questions. She didn't pry or push or insist I explain what happened. She set a plate of breakfast on the counter and told me to eat whenever I felt like it. That quiet kindness hurt more than the cruelty I was running from. I wasn't used to care without cost. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion. Not physical, but emotional, like my body was trying to adjust to a life where survival didn't mean shrinking, apologizing, or sacrificing. I tried not to think about them, my family, my sister, the lies, the decisions made without me present or considered. But thoughts came anyway, uninvited, loud, and sharp. I avoided the neighborhood where the house stood. I stopped checking my phone. I didn't want updates, apologies, explanations, or excuses. I didn't want anyone to drag me back into the old rhythms of obedience and silence. I didn't want promises about change. I wanted distance, space, air that wasn't tainted by resentment. Nights were the hardest. When the lights were off and the house settled into quiet, memories rose from places I didn't know they'd been stored. The fear of abandonment, the humiliation of being pushed aside, the ache of realizing no one had fought for me. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just lay there awake, with the weight of everything I didn't say pressing against my ribcage. I wasn't sure if it was grief or relief. Maybe both. Days passed, and I started breathing easier. Not because things got better, but because they were honest now. There was no pretending, no performing, no masking the parts of myself that had been inconvenient. Losing everything stripped away the distractions, the surface-level comfort, and forced me to see myself clearly for the first time in years. It didn't feel like freedom at first. Freedom is loud, expansive, liberating. What I felt was quieter, more like a cautious sense of possibility, like I was learning how to move without shackles. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't know who I'd become after the dust settled. All I knew was that I had survived the moment they expected me to break. I had walked away from the place that had chosen convenience over compassion. And even though I didn't feel strong yet, there was a slow, steady certainty building inside me, like the foundation of a life that wasn't built on someone else's terms. I had lost my home, but I hadn't lost myself. And somewhere in that unfamiliar room, under blankets that didn't belong to me, I began to realize that maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start over. I didn't go back for my things. Whatever was left of my old life could stay there, boxed up with their decisions. I wasn't going to step into that house again, just to prove I still existed. They had already erased me. I refused to be the one digging through the ashes trying to salvage scraps. Life didn't transform overnight. There wasn't some cinematic moment where everything fell into place, where I suddenly felt healed and hopeful. It was slower, quieter, like learning how to breathe correctly after years of holding your lungs too tight. I didn't rush. I didn't force anything. I just lived, day by day, inside a space that wasn't built around someone else's expectations. My aunt gave me room to figure it out. Not advice, not lectures, not guilt-laced reminders of what I'd lost, just space. It was strange at first, to exist without feeling monitored or measured. I caught myself waiting for criticism, waiting for someone to tell me my choices were selfish or inconvenient. But no one did. The silence was disorienting, like stepping into sunlight after so many hours underground. News about them reached me eventually, not because I wanted it, but because people talk. They said things were messy back at the house, arguments, regret, financial strain. The plans that had pushed me out collapsed under the weight of their reality. The perfect picture they had rushed to create fell apart because it had been built on entitlement, not care. It didn't make me happy exactly, but it settled something inside me. Not revenge. Not bitterness. Just confirmation that I hadn't been wrong to walk away. I didn't seek closure. I didn't apologize. I didn't return calls from people who suddenly remembered my name when their convenience ran dry. I wasn't cruel. I was done. There's a difference. Some days, I missed the version of myself who believed that love could make people better. But most days, I was grateful that I no longer lived inside that illusion. I was tired, but I wasn't beholden to anyone who saw me as expendable. I found a job, not glamorous or perfect, but mine. I saved money. I built routines. I learned how to make a space feel like home, even if it wasn't permanent. I talked to my aunt on quiet evenings, not about the past, but about recipes and books and small, ordinary things that didn't ask me to bleed to prove I mattered. Time passed, and the sharp edges of what happened dulled into something manageable. The story didn't define me anymore. It just marked a turning point. The night I walked away hadn't been an ending. It was the first real choice I made for myself in a long time. Sometimes, when I lay in bed at night, I thought about that life, clean floors, perfect dinners, a house full of people who believed they could rearrange my existence without consequence. It felt distant, like a dream someone else had told me about. I didn't feel anger for them anymore. Just distance. A comfortable, necessary distance. I didn't rebuild myself stronger. I rebuilt myself quieter, more intentional. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. I stopped handing my life over to people who valued convenience more than compassion. I stopped believing I had to earn a place in rooms I was already standing in. One afternoon, much later, I passed the old neighborhood on a bus. I didn't get off. I didn't look for the house. I just let it roll by, letting the past fade into the landscape like every other place I'd moved through. By then, I realized something important. I hadn't lost everything when I walked away. I had lost the version of my life that required me to be small. And that wasn't grief, it was release. I didn't need them to understand what they'd done. I didn't need them to regret it. I didn't need apologies or acknowledgments or attempts to rewrite the narrative. The truth was simple. They made a choice. I made one too. And mine saved me. I didn't go back. I didn't look back. I didn't miss the life I left behind. I began again. And for the first time, it was enough.
If you enjoyed this video, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel and lets us bring you more and better stories.